Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 23, Freedom. In the late spring of 1977, I was approved for a 2-day furlough. Under prison guidelines, I could go on furlough if approved once I neared my parole eligibility date. I knocked down more than 2 years in the joint and had less than 1 to go. When my furlough date arrived that June, I went to the administration building to sign my release papers. Looking through a glass and steel cage, I could see my stepfather sitting on the bench in the hallway waiting for me. When I walked through the cage, he stood, extended his hand and smiled. We both stood there, vigorously shaking hands and grinning broadly. "How you doing?" "Fine," my lips quivered. "I can't believe this." As we headed for the car, I thought about the many nights I had lain on my bunk, trying to imagine how it would feel to walk through that door. It felt just like I thought it would. Wonderful. On the ride home, we talked about general things. How close I was to parole eligibility, how healthy I looked. My stepfather showed me his new CB radio. There were still uneasy silences between us, but the broad gulf that had separated us didn't seem as wide as it used to be. I realized during my time in prison that a lot of the lessons he tried to teach my brothers and me, especially lessons about the dignity of work, were on the money. Sitting there, I wanted to let him know that I was beginning to see life differently and to tell him I better understood where he was coming from. But I didn't say it. I still hadn't reached a point where I could express my deepest emotions to him. We rode, and I looked anxiously out the window at all the forgotten sights flying past and took in the warm feel of the bright summer day. 2 hours later, we pulled into Cavalier Manor. I nearly broke down and cried when I saw my old neighborhood. As we drove along, I scanned all the houses of people I knew and wondered what courses their lives had taken. We turned onto Darren Drive and wound along the curve leading to our street. When we got there and drove up to the house, my mother was standing in the doorway waiting. I went into the house, hugged her, then walked quickly through every room to refresh my memory. I went out back into the yard and checked out the once bald spots where my brothers and I had played sandlot basketball and baseball as young boys. I never knew home meant so much. That afternoon, I walked to a friend's house, stopped by the 7-Eleven, and ran into some of the fellas, including Lep, Hope, the dude I did my first B&E with, and Shane, who had heard I was coming home. We talked a short while, then I left. I didn't want to spend much time with them. The entire time I was down, they hadn't written or visited me, and I was pissed. I remembered that when Holt had done his prison bid years before, I made it a point to keep in touch with him. Later that day, Nutbrain came by. He and Charlie Gregg had recently been paroled. Seeing my man Nutbrain was like seeing an old war buddy. We posed for pictures in front of my stepfather's new El Dorado and caught up on each other's lives. Nutbrain said he was looking for work and trying to readjust. "I'm trying to get my act together. Things out here have changed a lot, man. It's strange." Then Liz came by with Monroe, who was then 4 years old. I was glad Monroe was still too young to understand that I was doing time. I played with him in the background, but still found it hard to connect with him being my son. What was different was I felt a greater sense of responsibility for him than I had before. I nearly came apart when I first saw Liz. She looked as beautiful as ever. We embraced, then stood back and looked at each other long and hard. Her eyes were sad and she seemed tentative, like she felt guilty about having left me and was unsure how she should act. She said in one of her last letters that she thought we should give our thing another try. I wanted to ask questions. What did that letter mean? Was she still dating? Did she have a man? But none of that mattered at the moment. All that mattered was that she was there and open to the possibility that we could try again. The three of us, Liz, Monroe, and I, spent most of the days at my folks' house talking and eating. The following night, my mother babysat, and Liz and I went to a hotel. She had gotten reservations at one of the best hotels in the area, the Omni in downtown Norfolk, so that we could celebrate our reunion in style. I had hoped that after a night of passionate lovemaking, we both conclude that we couldn't do without each other. I fantasized that we'd bring back the fire we once had, and that everything would come together in a nice, tidy ending, like in the movies. But it didn't work out that way. It felt so strange being out of prison that I couldn't unwind. She was uptight too. That night we talked, we argued, we cried, we mourned the passing of our relationship. We realized, even in bed, that our old chemistry wasn't there. We both changed and grown. It seemed in different directions. The next morning, Liz drove me home. We said another tearful goodbye. Sunday came around in no time. It felt weird riding back to prison voluntarily. On the way, my stepfather let me brood in peace. I think he knew how hard it was for me to return, and he realized that it was no use trying to lighten my mood with chit-chat. I got back to Southampton, and my homies crowded around to get the latest scoop from the streets. How was it, man? Did you get over? Who did you see on the block? I finished talking with them, went to my cell, and went to bed early to brood some more. The furlough had come and gone so fast it felt like I had dreamed it. I grew seriously uptight when I got closer to parole eligibility. It was the kind of uptight where you can barely speak and your fuse is short and everybody knows to keep their distance till you get through your hell. Dudes were getting turn downs left and right, and I was scared that my motivation or sanity would slip if I got denied. I knew my case would be a tough call for the parole board. There were a few matters working against me. I was a repeat offender. I was on probation for another felony when I stuck up the hamburger joint, and both crimes involved the use of a gun. But there were also some things working in my favor. Except for a few minor infractions, I've been a model prisoner, if there is such a thing. I stayed clean, obeyed the rules, and most important, I had a supportive family to go to, unlike many inmates who had nowhere to go. The trip home made me focus more on my future and try to figure out what I should do if paroled. I definitely wanted to return to college, but to study what? I considered studying to be a librarian when I got out. After reading about Margaret Mead's fieldwork with the Hopi Indians, I became so fascinated I thought I might want to study anthropology. When I read Ernest Hemingway, I thought I might be a writer. I also reminded myself of reality as I viewed it. White people pursue careers. Black folks pursue jobs. I marveled that white people made livings in so many interesting ways beyond working at a shipyard or joining the army. Jim had urged me to learn a trade before leaving prison, and I knew that too would help my parole chances. He said most of the guys in prison couldn't be rehabilitated because they had never been habilitated in the first place. I looked up the word habilitate and concluded he was right. The definition said, to make capable, qualify. Most inmates couldn't be requalified because they had never been qualified for anything before going to prison. The only skills most of those guys at Southampton could boast of was their nut games, their ability to throw down. Auto mechanics, dentistry, brick masonry, and several other vocational trades were offered at Southampton, but none of that interests me. Jim, who operated the print shop for the complex, taught me how to use the small printing press, and shortly before leaving, told me about a lucrative scam he'd run. He printed bogus copies of the canteen cards that were distributed to inmates as their monthly pay. He gave some fake cards to needy inmates and sold most of the rest to other prisoners at discount rates for cash. Whenever he got visits, he sent the cash home to be placed in a bank account so that he'd have money saved up when he got out. I decided to learn the printing trade. I wrote the warden and state prison officials asking for a transfer to the minimum security St. Bridget's Correctional Center, which had the only printing program in the state prison system. A month or so later, I noted in my journal when I got the good news. Well, my transfer to St. Bridget's had been approved, and now I am waiting to leave. I must get into the habit of stepping out into the unknown and making the necessary sacrifices for the things I want. My goals must be in focus at all times. I must eat, drink, sleep, and think college until I am there. It's me against the world. July 25th, 1977. Less than a month later, a guard came to my cell one morning and told me, "Pack your bags and go to the administration building." I was to be transferred to St. Bridget's. The St. Bridget's compound is located in Chesapeake, less than 20 miles from Cavalier Manor. When I wrote my mother and told her where I was, she was thrilled. It was as if the closer proximity to home was a symbolic sign that I was also nearer to freedom. Compared to Southampton, St. Bridget's was easy time. The atmosphere was more laid back. Most inmates had little time to do and light convictions: burglary, drug abuse, parole violation. Others with serious felony convictions, such as mine, were close enough to parole eligibility to have their prison status upgraded to minimum security. There were no wolves to speak of at St. Bridget's. It was understood that being in such a chilled out place was a privilege, and guys seldom did anything crazy that might get them shipped to rougher compounds. The Richmond and Tidewater gangs also dominated at St. Bridget's, but the tension level was so low it didn't matter whether guys had homies or not. The first day I got there, I ran into homeboys from Portsmouth and of course from Cavalier Manor. Red, Wink Wink, Al Porter, Piggy Hume, and Reed. They were glad to see me and helped me get settled in, just like my homies had done before. I got acclimated in no time. Most evenings after chow, I hung out in the yard playing chess and shooting the breeze. At night, we watched TV or hung out in each other's bunks in the dormitory cells, like soldiers in the barracks, rapping about the streets and listening to music. I found a lot of ways to keep busy. I entered and won the annual chess tournament at the complex. The win and the trophy, I still have it, were especially sweet because I beat an egotistical white inmate in the finals. I fasted for 2 days in preparation for that match and beat that white boy like he stole something. Jim and Mo Battle would have been proud of me. Since I was so close to home, more people were able to visit me. One visitor was my neighbor Greg, who had remained close to my family and who was living at home after being kicked out of the army. I also got visits from Yvette Johnson, an old school friend I run into when I got home on furlough. I was so grateful for female companionship that I instantly fell for Yvette the first time she visited. Overall, I treated St. Bridget's like an adventure. Going there and having to adjust to a new environment all over again helped kill time. That's what I needed in those last few months, to kill time, to keep myself preoccupied with so many challenges that time passed unnoticed. While waiting the opening for print shop classes, I worked in the kitchen. I rose early every morning, dressed in my white hat and Pillsbury Doughboy uniform, and helped prepare inmates' meals. When mealtime came, I worked in the serving line, scooping food from the deep containers and loaded it onto inmates' trays. One day, a group of about 10 people came through the kitchens as part of a citizen's tour. I was cleaning tables as they passed into the dining area and sat down. As I set glasses of tea on tables before them, I recognized one of the men in the group. It was Mr. Brown, my junior high school gym teacher. His hair had gone gray and he'd grown a mustache, but otherwise he looked the same. When our eyes met, he stared at me a long time, straining to remember. He pointed a finger and squinted his eyes. "Where do I know you from? You were in one of my classes, weren't you?" "Yes," I said. "I took gym and helped under you at W.E. Waters. I'm Nathan McCall." "That's right, McCall." The Mr. Brown I remembered would have started joning on the spot. But nothing was funny now. I could tell he was disappointed and hurt to see me, one of his former students, doing time. He looked long and hard and remained silent, wondering, I assumed, what to say next. Then he asked, "What are you in for, McCall?" I said armed robbery. He shook his head slightly. A wave of shame passed through me. I felt like I should try to explain, to let him know I expected to get out soon, and assure him that I intended to straighten up. But what was there to explain? What good would it do? Mr. Brown suddenly realized that the other visitors, all white, were staring. He stiffened and became self-conscious, lowering his voice when he spoke and occasionally cutting an eye at his white colleagues. Eventually, the institutional guy urged the group to move on to the next phase of the tour. Before leaving, Mr. Brown leaned low toward me and said, "Hang in there." "Sure, I'll see you around, Mr. Brown." I waved goodbye. I relived that 15-minute encounter over and over in my mind the rest of the day. I thought about how hard Mr. Brown used to joan and preach to guys in our class at Waters, and how many of his former students were either dead or in prison like me. Seeing him made me remember how hard I studied for one of his midterm exams, and for some strange reason, I still recall snatches of the definition of one of the health terms I memorized but never quite grasped. Basal metabolism. I wish I could have talked with him longer. Mr. Brown was one of many black people who had shown me and other students that he cared, and I wanted to let him know that I finally understood the value of such caring. I wanted to tell him that his efforts had not been in vain, even though, judging from my circumstances, that seemed to be the case. But Mr. Brown was gone, and there was nothing to do but to grieve in my journal. Today I saw Mr. Brown, my former gym teacher from junior high school. I could see that he was hurt and disappointed to see me in prison. He had one of those "where did I fail" looks in his eyes. I wanted to tell him that he had been a good teacher to me. I wanted to convince him to recite something that he taught me in health class. Basal metabolism is the rate at which the heart makes up heat from the oxygen and food substances in the blood. Maybe that's right, maybe not. There are so many Mr. Browns out there who do their damnedest to teach the Nathan McCalls that there is a right way and a wrong way, a good way and a bad. And there are far too many Nathan McCalls who simply must learn the hard way. September 17th, 1977. No, African Americans spend much time in prison without being exposed to the doctrines of black Muslims. Ever since the Nation of Islam was founded in the 1930s, it has drawn a lot of its converts from prison, where the Muslims have a captive audience of brothers to teach in what they call the plain truth. The Muslims commanded as much respect as any group at Southampton. Always neatly dressed and well behaved, they walked around in their kufis, carrying copies of the Holy Quran and spreading their message of black salvation through self-reliance. Brothers respected Muslims for being disciplined, religious people, and at the same time warriors. The Muslims didn't believe in that stuff about turning the other cheek. Nobody messed with them, because many of them were hard-nosed cats who were eager to throw down for a righteous cause. The Muslims at St. Bridget's were led by a guy named Rasul, who was respected there like Jim was revered at Southampton. When I got to St. Bridget's, Rasul watched me from a distance for a while, then sent two of his representatives to invite me to the weekly service that he led. I went to the service and later talked with him over a few games of chess. Initially, I was skeptical, but after checking out the Muslims' beliefs, I was impressed. The group Razul represented was the American Muslim Mission, not to be confused with the Nation of Islam, which is led by Louis Farrakhan. The Muslim Mission is led by Raif Muhammad, the son of one-time Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad. When Elijah died in 1975, Warith and Farrakhan split because Warith wanted to lead the group to a more orthodox practice of the faith. They had evolved a lot from the 1960s when they railed about Yaqub, the big-headed scientist who, according to them, created white people from a mixture of pig and dog. Rasul explained all that to me when we talked. He also turned me on to one of the hippest books I read in prison. It was a thin, simply written paperback titled Natural Psychology and Human Transformation, written by Dr. Naeem Akbar, a black psychologist who is also a Muslim. The book suggests ways that people can develop their full potential. It grabbed my attention right off the bat because after wasting so many years messing around in the streets, I was trying to do double time to gain direction in mental health. In his book, Dr. Akbar uses the example of the butterfly, which goes through several incarnations, from a caterpillar to a flying insect to reach full development. He says that human beings similarly had the potential to develop and transform in stages. He says we start off in the caterpillar stage as crawling babies, concerned solely with satisfying our most physical needs. Then we evolve into mental beings who were able to think and extend our desires beyond basic physical drives. Our highest and most beautiful stage of development, he says, is spiritual, a state that enables us to soar symbolically like a butterfly. Dr. Akbar says that most people don't understand the developmental process and as a result, do not even strive to reach their highest potential. In fact, he says many people grow up and remain mentally locked in the warm, light first stage, the baby stage, where they focus solely on satisfying their base physical appetites. When I reflected, I realized that my entire life before prison had been spent locked in that baby stage. Most of the dudes I knew had lived like that. In fact, when I really thought about it, it seemed that much of American culture was conditioned that way. Self-absorbed, driven mainly by greed for material possessions, and uninterested in evolving to a higher state or extending concern beyond self to other human beings. Natural psychology and human transformation helped me focus more intently on reaching my spiritual peak. Whenever I fasted and meditated, I could feel my spirit strengthening. I realized that there was an entire aspect of myself, probably the most important aspect, that I had completely ignored for most of my life. It was an enlightening discovery for me. I got lots of what I had gone to St. Bridget's for. The printing program had a top-notch instructor and featured the latest equipment. I learned to operate offset presses, do studio photography, layout, and plate making, the whole printing process from start to finish. The instructor was a friendly, philosophical white man who seemed to genuinely enjoy teaching. Some days when the class was over, he spent time chatting with us about the challenges we could expect to face when we returned to the real world. He said, and I knew, that my chances of success would be increased greatly if I could find a decent printing job or get into college. More and more, I found that I enjoyed writing. I narrowed my career choices down to English literature and journalism. I tried to find out all I could about journalism, what it is that journalists do, how much they earn, etc. I recalled how 2 journalists at the Washington Post had used their reporting skills to kick the corrupt president square in the ass, and that seemed like the kind of thing I'd like to learn. I wrote the head of Norfolk State University's journalism department, explained my situation, and told him I wanted badly to make a new start. The department head, Dr. Larry Kagwa, wrote back to me. He also entered me in a competition that required me to write a paper explaining why I wanted to study journalism. I wrote the paper and won a 1-year tuition scholarship. I was pleasantly stunned. It was the second time in months that I had gone after something geared towards self-improvement, and gotten it. Dr. Cagua's quick response also boosted my belief that black colleges and universities are committed to helping blacks beyond the classroom. I'll bet that if I went from prison to the department head at some white university, he probably would have notified the campus police or sought an order barring me from coming within 50 yards of his white campus. That help from Dr. Cagua would go a long way in helping me demonstrate to the parole board that I had solid plans to get rolling once I spring. About 2 weeks before my hearing, I got a last-minute plug from my print shop instructor. An inmate got his hand caught in one of the large presses. When he screamed, I ran over, turned off the machine, reversed the rollers, and pulled out his hand before it could be sucked into the feeders like a sheet of paper. His hand was cut up pretty badly, but he made out all right considering what could have happened. The instructor thanked me for reacting so quickly and wrote a letter of commendation for my prison file. I was good to go. On the day before I went before the parole board, I was so nervous I was nearly paralyzed. I was scared that I'd get in there, get asked a question, and choked. I was scared that when it was time for me to speak, all my suffering would come to the surface and all my emotions would bum rush my throat and nothing could come out. So I did deep breathing exercises and prayed for the best. I waited in a hallway with about 6 other dudes who were going before the board that day. All of us looked alike. We looked like choir boys sitting out there. We were spit-shined and scrubbed and lotioned down to the max. We all had our hair cut short. We had our shirts buttoned to the very top, and we were so quiet you could hear the roaches walking across the shiny floor. But appearances didn't seem to sway the board. When dudes came out of the meeting after the board, they were red-eyed and withdrawn. I asked one guy how he thought things had gone for him. He looked at me, shook his head slowly, and said, "It looks bad for the home team." When my name was called, I went in and took a seat before the board members, several white men and a black woman who sat behind a long table. It was a stern-faced, tight-butt bunch, no nonsense all the way. They asked a few questions about my crime, my family, that sort of thing. Then, after several other minor questions, came the biggie. "So, Mr. McCall, what do you plan to do to better yourself if you get out, and what arrangements have you made to carry out those plans?" If a cat hasn't given serious consideration to his future, really thought it out, that's the question that cold cocks him. That's the one that renews his lease for another year. If he's wasted his time and neglected to improve himself, he can't answer that question convincingly. He's down for the count. TKO. With the parole board, you got to come strong or not at all, because they've heard all the bullshit they care to hear and they can smell it a mile away. I knew all that going in. I knew I couldn't go in there half-stepping. I was prepared. My future? Shit, I had thought about it, prayed about it, and dreamed about it the entire time I was down. I had thought a hell of a lot about my future, enough to know that I might not have a future if I didn't get sprung that first time up. When they hit me with the question, they hit the right person that time because I was ready. I rapped. I rapped hard. I rapped harder than I'd ever rapped in my life. I took all the skills I picked up rapping with those penitentiary philosophers out on the yard and threw the whole handful at the parole board. I told them all I'd done to improve myself in the nearly 3 years that I'd been locked up, and shared my plans to go home to my family and to enroll at Norfolk State. I told them that robbing that hamburger joint was the stupidest thing I could have done, and that I spent a lot of time thinking about that and the other mistakes I made in my life. The bottom line was, I came straight from the heart. I came from so deep within the heart that I surprised myself. But I meant every word I said. I was changed. I knew it, and I wanted to make sure they knew it. I'll bet those white folks on that parole board were glad when I finally finished talking. I'll bet they thought I'd never shut up. I'll bet that when I finished and I left the room, they burst out laughing and said, "Damn, we need to hurry up and let this nigga out. This dude wants badly to get out of here." But they didn't come off like that. They were very professional. When I finished talking, one of the parole board members said, "Thank you, Mr. McCall. The board will take into consideration all that you have said. You will be notified within the next month of our decision." They sent me on my way without a hint of the verdict. Waiting for an answer was like waiting to be sentenced all over again. Those few weeks were as hard on me as the entire 3 years had been. I nagged my institutional counselor constantly to see if a response had come. He got mad at me for nagging him, and I got mad at him for getting mad at me. If he had been an inmate and not a counselor, we would have come to blows because I was uptight as hell and already had a head full of steam. When my letter from the board finally arrived, I took it to my bunk and sat down alone. I looked at the letter in the sealed envelope a long time before even attempting to open it. I needed a drink, but since there were no bars open in the penitentiary, I had to face it straight. I gave myself a long talking to before opening it. Keep cool. You've done the best you could do. You've given it your best shot and programmed hard. Stay strong no matter what happens. Then I opened the letter and I could hardly believe it. For a long while, I just sat there staring at the words, reading the letter over and over, making sure I'd gotten it right. I thought, I made parole. I made it. I'm getting out. They're going to let me go. I can go home. Soon. I made it. I can't believe it. I made it. I made parole. Waiting for my February 3rd, 1978 release date was worse than waiting for the parole letter, especially in the final few weeks. There were times, crazy moments, when reason escaped me and I feared something weird might happen to make them revoke my parole. I had heard horror stories of dudes who caught new charges while waiting to walk. Once, at Southampton, a dude got set up on a reefer bus only a few days before he was to leave. He went to court and got more time. I had no known enemies who would do that to me, but I knew that in the craziness of prison life, anything was possible. I wouldn't have been too surprised if my counselor had come to me and said, "The parole board notified me that they made a mistake. They sent the letter to the wrong person. You got turned down." That's the kind of stuff that happens sometimes. Any inmate with half a brain knows not to get too happy. He knows that it ain't over till it's over. He's not free until he walks out that front door. So I waited and struggled through the toughest few weeks of my entire bid. Even though I have made parole, time is no easier to conquer than it was nearly 3 years ago. A day is still 24 grueling hours, and a week is still an eternity. The fact that I will soon be freed has eased my present suffering very little, for in my heart, I am serving a life sentence until the day I walk out of that front gate. January 16th, 1978. In our final talk before I went home, the print shop instructor told me something I never forgot. Make sure that whatever you do, you find a job in an atmosphere that is psychologically comfortable for you. I appreciated the intent, but I needed that piece of advice like I needed a .25 automatic with extra clips. It was clear to me that, as a white man, my instructor came from a reality that gave him enough choices to be able to look for a comfortable work environment. But that was a foreign concept to me, a contradiction in terms. I knew that if I worked, I'd likely work for white folks. So how could that be comfortable? I figured that if I followed my instructor's advice and looked for a comfortable work environment, I'd be unemployed all my life, unless I worked for a black-owned business or started one myself. I politely thanked my instructor for the advice and moved on, thinking he meant well. He didn't know no better. When I thought about it later, I concluded that his advice was better suited for those happy-faced white boys in my printing class. Using connections they made on the outside, most of them landed job guarantees at local commercial print shops before their prison release. It pissed me off that the white boys had the inside track, even in the penitentiary. They acted like they had it made, like they knew they were going to get back into the flow of things as soon as they were sprung. They were chilled, and I was nervous as hell, anxious and scared at the same time, wondering what would happen to me on the outside if things didn't work out. I have observed that many whites here seem unfazed by their plight in prison. They regard confinement merely as a temporary restraint from their usual lives, and they face the future with optimism, confident that they have only to slip on a coat and tie, get a haircut, and shave for the establishment to forgive their transgressions. But most blacks look ahead with apprehension, afraid that we may never be forgiven for our crimes or the color of our skin. January 24th, 1978. I remember clearly that snowy February day in 1978 when I was released from the joint. My homies gathered on the sidewalk that morning and watched me leave. As I climbed into the car and my mother drove off, I cast a long, hard look at the prison, and tears began streaming uncontrollably down my face. I felt a strange mixture of pain and pride. I was mostly proud that I had survived, and I told myself then and there, I can do anything. Although it had been the most tragic event in my life, prison, with all its sickness and suffering, had also been my most instructional challenge. It forced me to go deep, real deep, within and tap a well I didn't know I had. Through that painful trip, I found meaning. No longer was life a thing of bewilderment. No longer did I feel like a cosmic freak, a black intruder in the world not created for me and my people. No longer were my angry feelings about the vast white world simply vague, invalid impulses dangling on the edge of my mind. I knew the reasons for those feelings now. I understood them better, and, most important, I could express them precisely as they arose. I knew there was purpose in design and creation, and that my life was somehow part of that grand scheme. I had just as much right to be alive and happy as anybody else, and I wasn't going to let anybody, especially not white folks, make me feel otherwise. Okay, this brings us to the end of chapter 23 and the beginning of part 3. Something that I want to do now at the end of these chapters is just, open the floor for some discussion in the comments. One of the things that I've noticed that's still current to this day is that when your life lacks a focus, you can get into all types of trouble. Nathan McCall and his friends, they didn't have a focus in their life. They didn't know what they wanted to do. So they were kind of just wandering around aimlessly, just existing, waiting to get into trouble and trying to figure out how to survive in a world that seemed so foreign to them. One of the things that I think that we miss out on as a society or as a people is that we don't have a rites of passage to mark our way into manhood. Now, there's not just one thing that men as a whole or boys as a whole go through that's going to teach them, okay, this is symbolic of the things that you're going to go through in life. And now that you're going through this process, this rites of passage, you should be more prepared to face life. Some of us get to do that through sports. I guess you can say high school is some type of rites of passage, but we know public education isn't really educating us to get to that point. People who get to join a fraternity or a sorority or pledge, they go through a rites of passage. But for Nathan McCall, it seems like his rite of passage was having to go through prison and coming out on the other side of it as a better person. Some people go to prison, they just become better criminals. But Nathan McCall was able to use that time to better himself. I imagine what it would be like if all the people who went to prison really got that chance to better themselves while they're in there. I also imagine what it would be like if that wasn't necessary. We had that focus before we did something that got us sent to prison. But anyway, I've been enjoying reading this book for you guys. I hope you've been enjoying listening to it. Let me know in the comments what you think about the lack of a rite of passage for black men in this country. And what do you think that's doing to us as a whole? I think we need more community effort to come up with some type of program for our young men to go through, and even some of the adult men, because I know there's adult men out there kind of wandering around with no aim. When I finished college, I decided that, I'm not interested in being a band director anymore. That's what I went to school for, music education. But something in my spirit was just pulling me away from that. When I looked at the state of the current school system and how I felt about school, it almost felt like I'd be joining the police force trying to make it better, when I know as a whole the police force isn't out, for the benefit of black people. And I feel that same way about school. The best things that I've learned came from stuff that I had to go out and learn on my own. But anyway, thanks for listening. I'll catch you guys in the next chapter. And leave some comments below. Let me know what you think. Peace.